I never thought I'd be that kind of woman. The type who cheats on her husband, the type who sneaks around with another man. But life has a way of surprising you, of leading you down paths you never expected to travel. My name is Sarah Thompson, and this is my story. It began on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday in May. James, my husband of 12 years, had just left for another extended business trip to Asia. These trips had become more frequent over the past year, 2 weeks here, 3 weeks there. He was climbing the corporate ladder at his investment bank, and each promotion seemed to require more time away from home. I was in our kitchen, absently stirring my morning coffee while looking out over our immaculately maintained 2-acre property in Greenwich, Connecticut. That's when I first saw him. Lucas Martinez, our new gardener. The landscaping company we used had sent an email the week before, informing us that our regular gardener, old Mr. Peterson, had retired and they were assigning someone new. I hadn't given it much thought until that moment. Lucas was different from what I expected. Younger, for one thing, probably in his late 20s. He moved with an athletic grace as he unloaded his equipment from his truck. His tan skin gleamed in the morning sun, and even from a distance, I could see the way his muscles flexed under his fitted t-shirt. I found myself watching him longer than necessary, appreciating the fluid way he moved, the careful attention he paid to each task. When he looked up and caught me staring, I quickly stepped back from the window, feeling my cheeks flush like a schoolgirl. Later that morning, I ventured outside, ostensibly to check on my rose bushes. Lucas was kneeling by the flower beds, his hands deep in the soil. "Good morning," I called out, trying to sound casual. "I'm Sarah Thompson." He stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans before extending one to shake mine. "Lucas Martinez." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Thompson." His voice was deep and smooth, with just a hint of an accent. His handshake was firm, his palm calloused from work but surprisingly gentle. And his eyes, God, his eyes were the most intense shade of brown I'd ever seen, flecked with gold in the sunlight. "Please, call me Sarah," I said, holding his gaze perhaps a moment too long. "Would you like some water? It's getting quite warm out here." "That would be very kind, thank you." I hurried back to the kitchen, my heart beating faster than it should have been. What was wrong with me? He was our gardener, for heaven's sake. But when I returned with the water, I couldn't help but notice the way his throat moved as he drank, or how a drop of water traced its way down his neck. Over the next few weeks, I found myself looking forward to Tuesdays more than I'd care to admit. I started timing my morning coffee to coincide with Lucas's arrival. Our conversations grew longer, more personal. I learned he was 28, had studied botany in college, and was saving money to start his own landscaping business. He learned about my love for classical literature, my failed attempts at painting, and my growing loneliness in my too-big house. James called less frequently from his business trips. When he did call, our conversations were brief and perfunctory. "How are you?" "Fine." "How's the house?" "Fine. I'll be home next week." "Okay." We'd become strangers connected by a mortgage and memories of better times. One particularly hot Tuesday in June, I brought Lucas some homemade lemonade. He was working on the garden house, repairing some weather damage to the roof. His shirt was off, draped over a nearby bush, and I nearly dropped the glasses when I saw him. "Careful," he said, quickly climbing down the ladder to steady me. His hands gripped my waist, and for a moment we stood frozen, too close, my hands still holding the lemonade tray between us. I brought you something to drink," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," he replied, but he didn't move his hands. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the subtle mix of sweat, and something distinctly masculine. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Lucas," I started to say, though I had no idea what would come next. He stepped back abruptly, running a hand through his dark hair. "I should get back to work." I nodded, setting the tray down on a nearby table. As I turned to leave, he called out, "Sarah?" I looked back. "You deserve better than this," he said softly. "Better than being left alone all the time." Something inside me broke at his words, because he was right. I did deserve better. I deserved someone who saw me, who was present, who made me feel alive instead of just existing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned in my empty bed, remembering the feeling of Lucas's hands on my waist, imagining what might have happened if neither of us had pulled away. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with tanned skin and golden-flecked brown eyes. The next Tuesday, it rained. I watched through the window as Lucas worked despite the weather, his clothes clinging to his body. Before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed an umbrella and went outside. "You should come in," I called out. "Wait out the rain." He hesitated and I added, "Please, I just made coffee." Lucas followed me into the house, leaving his muddy boots by the door. Water dripped from his clothes onto the marble floor of the foyer, and without thinking I said, "Let me get you a towel. And maybe some dry clothes. I think some of James's things might fit you." I hurried upstairs, my hands shaking as I pulled out a t-shirt and sweatpants from James's drawer. When I returned, Lucas was standing exactly where I'd left him, looking somehow both powerful and vulnerable in his wet clothes. "The bathroom's down the hall," I said, handing him the clothes and towel. "I'll make that coffee." In the kitchen, I busied myself with the coffee maker, trying to calm my racing thoughts. What was I doing? Inviting him in was dangerous. Being alone with him was dangerous. Everything about this situation screamed danger. When he emerged from the bathroom, wearing James's clothes, something possessive stirred inside me. He looked different like this, softer somehow, but no less magnetic. His damp hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and I had to grip the kitchen counter to stop myself from reaching out to touch it. "Thank you," he said, accepting the coffee mug I offered. Our fingers brushed, and electricity shot through me. We stood in silence for a moment, the sound of rain against the windows the only noise. Then Lucas set his mug down and turned to face me fully. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and intense. "We both know this isn't just about coffee." I couldn't meet his eyes. "I'm married," I whispered, but it sounded weak even to my own ears. "To a man who's never here. To a man who leaves you alone in this big house, who doesn't see how extraordinary you are." He stepped closer, and I could smell my husband's laundry detergent on him, mixed with his own scent. The combination was intoxicating. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his hand coming up to cup my cheek. "Tell me you don't feel this too, and I'll walk away right now." I should have said it, should have stopped this before it started. Instead, I leaned into his touch, my eyes fluttering closed. His lips met mine softly at first, questioning. When I didn't pull away, the kiss deepened, became hungry, desperate. His hands tangled in my hair as mine clutched at his borrowed shirt, pulling him closer. He tasted like coffee and rain and forbidden desires. We stumbled backward until I hit the kitchen counter. Lucas lifted me easily, setting me on the cool marble surface as his lips traced a path down my neck. I wrapped my legs around his waist, all thoughts of right and wrong forgotten in the heat of his touch. "We shouldn't," I gasped, even as my hands slipped under his shirt, exploring the hard planes of his chest. "Do you want me to stop?" he asked, pulling back just enough to look into my eyes. I shook my head. "No," I whispered. "Don't stop." What happened next was a blur of sensation and desire. Lucas carried me upstairs to one of the guest rooms. Even in my passion-clouded state, I couldn't bring myself to use the master bedroom. His hands were everywhere, leaving trails of fire on my skin. When he finally entered me, it was with a gentleness that brought tears to my eyes. Afterward, we lay tangled in the sheets, the rain still pattering against the windows. Lucas traced lazy patterns on my bare shoulder while I tried to process what we'd just done. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, unable to form words. The guilt hadn't hit yet. That would come later. For now, I felt oddly peaceful, more alive than I had in years. "I should go," he said eventually, though he made no move to leave. The rain stopped. I knew he should. But I also knew that once he walked out that door, everything would change. Reality would crash back in, and I'd have to face what I'd done. "Stay," I whispered. "Just a little longer." He did. That was the beginning. What followed was 2 months of stolen moments and secret meetings. Every Tuesday became our day. Sometimes we made love in the garden house, surrounded by the scent of flowers and earth. Other times, when James was away, Lucas would come to the house after his work was done, and we'd spend hours exploring each other's bodies and minds. It wasn't just physical. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. He told me about growing up in California, about his dreams of owning his own business, about his passion for creating beautiful spaces. I shared my forgotten dreams of being a writer, my feelings of isolation in my perfect but empty life, my fears about the future. "You could write again," he said one afternoon as we lay in the garden house, my head on his chest. "You could do anything you want, Sarah." "Could I?" I mused. "Sometimes I feel like I'm trapped in a gilded cage. This house, this life, it's all so perfect on the surface, but you underneath." "Then leave," he said simply. "Come with me." I lifted my head to look at him. "Lucas, I'm serious," he said, sitting up. "I've been saving money. In a few months, I'll have enough to start my own business. We could go anywhere, start fresh." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I can't just leave James," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I wondered if that was true. "Why not?" Lucas challenged. "Does he make you happy? Does he make you feel alive like this?" His hand slid up my thigh, making me gasp. "It's not that simple," I protested weakly. "It could be," he whispered, pulling me into a kiss that made me forget all my arguments. But reality has a way of intruding on even the most perfect fantasy. The day everything changed started like any other Tuesday. Lucas arrived at his usual time, and we shared a discreet kiss behind the garden house before he started his work. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch for us when my phone rang. It was James. "Sarah," he said, his voice tight, "I'm coming home early, today." My blood ran cold. "Today? But you weren't supposed to be back until next week. The merger fell through. I'll be home in a few hours. We need to talk." The way he said "we need to talk" made my stomach clench. "Okay," I managed to say. "I'll see you then." I rushed outside to find Lucas. He was pruning the roses, his movements precise and careful. When he saw my face, he immediately put down his tools. "What's wrong?" "James is coming home, today." The words came out in a rush. "He said we need to talk. Lucas, I think he knows." Lucas's face darkened. "How could he know?" "I don't know, but the way he sounded." I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the summer heat. "You should go now." He reached for me, but I stepped back. "Sarah, don't push me away. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." "There is no we, Lucas," I said harshly, fear making me cruel. This was a mistake, all of it." The hurt in his eyes was almost unbearable. "You don't mean that. Please, just go." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded stiffly. "If that's what you want." I watched him pack up his tools and drive away, tears streaming down my face. Then I went inside to wait for James. He arrived 3 hours later. I had spent that time cleaning obsessively, as if I could erase all evidence of my infidelity with enough bleach and polish. When I heard his key in the lock, I was sitting in the living room, trying to look calm and collected. But when James walked in, he didn't look angry. He looked defeated. "Sarah," he said, sitting heavily in the armchair across from me, "I've met someone else." Of all the things I had expected him to say, this wasn't one of them. I sat there, stunned, as he continued. "Her name is Catherine. She's a financial analyst at our Tokyo office. It's been going on for 6 months. I think I'm in love with her." A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. All this time, while I'd been torturing myself with guilt over Lucas, James had been having his own affair. 6 months, I repeated numbly. All those business trips. James had the grace to look ashamed. Some of them were legitimate, but yes, many were to see her. "And now what?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice was. "You're leaving me for her?" He nodded slowly. "She's pregnant, Sarah." The words hit me like a physical blow. Pregnant. While I'd been playing house with Lucas, James had been building a new life with someone else. "I'm sorry," he said, and I believed he meant it. "I never meant for any of this to happen, but maybe it's for the best. We both know things haven't been right between us for a long time." I thought about arguing, about throwing his betrayal in his face, about telling him about Lucas just to see him hurt the way I was hurting. But what would be the point? "How long have you been unhappy?" I asked instead. James looked surprised by the question. I don't know. It happened so gradually. One day I just realized we were living parallel lives, not really touching anymore. I knew exactly what he meant. When had we stopped really seeing each other? When had we become strangers sharing a house? "I want you to have the house," he continued. "And of course there will be a generous settlement. You'll be well taken care of." "Taken care of," I repeated bitterly, like a pet being rehomed. "Sarah, please. I'm trying to do the right thing here." "The right thing would have been not sleeping with your colleague while still married to me," I snapped. Then I took a deep breath. "But you're right. Things haven't been right between us for a long time." We spent the next hour discussing practical matters, lawyers, division of assets, who would tell our families. It was surreal how civilized we were being about the end of 12 years of marriage. After James left to check into a hotel, I sat in the darkening house, trying to process everything. My marriage was over. My husband was having a baby with another woman, and somewhere out there was a man who had made me feel more alive in 2 months than I had felt in years. I reached for my phone and pulled up Lucas's number. My finger hovered over the call button. Was I ready for this? Ready to completely upend my life? Ready to risk everything for a chance at real happiness? The house seemed to close in around me, all its perfect emptiness suddenly suffocating. I thought about Lucas's words. "You could do anything you want, Sarah." I pressed call. When Lucas answered, his voice was guarded. "Sarah? Can you come over?" I asked. "I need to tell you something." He arrived 20 minutes later, still in his work clothes, looking like he'd been running his hands through his hair repeatedly. When I opened the door, he started to speak, but I held up my hand. "James is leaving me," I said. "Or rather, I'm leaving him. He's been having an affair. She's pregnant." Lucas's expression went from concern to shock to anger. "Sarah, I'm so sorry." I shook my head. "Don't be. It's actually perfect timing." "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath. "Remember when you asked me to come with you, to start fresh somewhere else?" His eyes widened. "Yes. Did you mean it? Every word." I stepped closer to him. "Then ask me again." Lucas cupped my face in his hands, his eyes searching mine. "Come with me, Sarah. Let's build something real together. Something that's ours." This time, when I kissed him, there was no guilt, no shame, no holding back. It felt like freedom, like possibility, like hope. 3 months later, I sold the house. James and I divorced amicably, all things considered. He moved to Tokyo to be with Catherine and their upcoming baby. I used part of the settlement money to help Lucas start his landscaping business in Colorado, where neither of us knew anyone, and where we could truly start fresh. We bought a small house with a big yard that Lucas is slowly turning into something magical. I've started writing again, working on a novel in the mornings while Lucas is at work. In the evenings, we sit on our back porch, planning our future and watching the sunset over the mountains. Sometimes I think about that first Tuesday when Lucas showed up to tend my perfect garden. How could I have known that he would end up tending to my soul instead? That in trying to maintain the appearance of a perfect life, I had been letting the real things slip away? Life isn't perfect now. We argue sometimes. Money can be tight. Starting over in your 30s isn't easy. But every morning when I wake up next to Lucas, feeling his arm around my waist and his breath on my neck, I know I made the right choice. Because sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow from broken ground. Sometimes you have to let things fall apart to build something better. And sometimes, just sometimes, what looks like an ending is really just the beginning.